Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the next edition in our Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series, Accessing the Coastal Carbon Atlas, a new Blue Carbon Data Clearinghouse tool. My name is Stephanie Simpson. I'm the Blue Carbon Program Director at Restore America's Estuaries, and on behalf of all of our presenters and the staff here at RAE, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Before we begin the presentation, I have a few quick announcements. First, for sound quality, all participants are placed in listen-only mode. If you are having any issues or technical problems, you can press *0 for operator assistance. You can also put anything in the chat or question box, and I'll be looking to respond to any issues that you might have along the way. We are also recording this webinar session, and the recording will be posted on our webpage at estuaries.org following the webinar. Following the presentations, we'll have a moderated Q&A. At any point during the webinar, you can enter your questions into the question box that's on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll work to answer as many questions as possible following the webinar or following the presentations. If we don't get to your question, feel free to email us, and our contact information will be listed at the end of the webinar. For those new to the webinar series, this is part of our Blue Carbon in Practice webinar series hosted by Restore America's Estuaries. A quick background on who we are: we're a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of our nation's bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. As part of this effort, we lead an alliance of 10 conservation organizations located across the U.S. coast. We convene a biannual national summit on coastal management and restoration, and we lead a number of national programs, including our Blue Carbon program. And for more information on any of this, you can visit our website at estuaries.org. I also want to let you know about another Blue Carbon in Practice webinar coming up in June, Blue Carbon in the Gulf of Mexico. We have speakers Dr. Anitra Thorhag and Dr. Jorge Lopez Portillo, who will be joining us then to talk about their research on blue carbon habitats in the Gulf of Mexico, including insights to status and trends on these habitats. To sign up for that webinar, I encourage you to go to our website at estuaries.org/bluecarbon and sign up for our Blue Carbon Buzz newsletter. But for today's webinar, I want to go ahead and introduce you to our speakers. As I mentioned before, my name is Stephanie Simpson. I will be serving as your webinar host and moderator today. I'm excited to be joined by colleagues from the Coastal Carbon Research Coordinating Network, who will be speaking more about the network as well as their newly launched Coastal Carbon Atlas tool. Our speakers include Dr. James Holmquist. James is an ecologist specializing in wetlands and climate change issues. James earned a BA in biology from Loyola Marymount University, where he also worked as an undergraduate researcher in the Bologna wetlands. During his PhD work at the University of California, LA, he began to research feedbacks between wetland landscapes, atmosphere, and climate on millennial timescales. And as a postdoc at UCLA and now at CERC, he leads efforts to measure carbon storage rates in coastal wetlands using dated sediment cores, as well as contributing to models of coastal resilience in the face of projected sea level rise. James is joined by Dave Klinges. Dave is the database manager for the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. His work includes curating data, designing web interfaces and data access tools, and coordinating data and skill-sharing workshops. As a full-stack ecologist, he also enjoys the front end of research by conducting fieldwork in coastal wetlands and forest. And finally, we're also joined by Dr. Pat McGonigal. Pat is an ecosystem ecologist with interest in carbon and greenhouse gas cycling and wetlands and forest, particularly as they relate to global change. Pat is the lead investigator of the Global Change Research Wetland, a world-class facility dedicated to unraveling the complex ecological processes that confer stability on coastal marshes as they respond to global environmental change. So thank you very much for our speakers all being with us today. And with that, I will go ahead and pass controls over to James to get us started for our presentation.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, James Holmquist here. Like Stephanie said, I'm a research scientist here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. I'm joined by Dave and Pat, who will be speaking shortly. I am the manager of the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network, which is an NSF-funded project. This is kind of a brain trust of a lot of different efforts and organizations, and some of our key partners are U.S. Geological Survey, Conservation International and their Blue Carbon Initiative, and the Marine Biological Laboratory. And today we're going to be talking to you, introducing our program overall, with special emphasis on our new fun toy, the Coastal Carbon Atlas. So here's a little bit of background for some of you who are new to tidal wetlands or new to thinking about carbon cycling. One of the reasons that tidal wetlands get so much attention in the carbon world is that there really are unique systems, kind of geographically, biologically, and chemically, in that they can store massive amounts of carbon in their soil. They can do it at a continuous rate. And they're, I think, one of the only ecosystems that I know of or that I can think of that can constantly store carbon without reaching a saturation point. They do this by having a dynamic feedback between sea level rise and soil formation that allows them to bank soil underground in low oxygen, salty water. Wetlands also can be the source of methane emissions. It's a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And those methane emissions are very dependent on salinity, with saltier wetlands emitting little or no methane and fresher wetlands emitting more methane. This last year was a huge year for coastal carbon inventorying at the national scale. These properties of tidal wetlands have kind of put them on the short list for more attention. National scale projects, particularly those kind of incentivized by the International Panel on Climate Change. This last year, coastal wetlands were included in the second State of the Carbon Cycle report, and for the first time were included in the US National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. There's also a lot of local interest and country-specific interest in using coastal wetland carbon to generate carbon credits. This is kind of where the phrase blue carbon comes in. And a lot of this is being prototyped in developing countries where wetland replanting and wetland preservation is a huge priority. And also there's a lot of interest here in the US, especially in some of these wetlands that are historically degraded or maybe isolated from tides or artificially freshened and are therefore putting out more methane than they should. So you kind of have both the carbon burial story and the methane emission story as part of the overall management package. You can credit greenhouse gas reductions to improving carbon burial or reducing methane emission. I'm kicking it over to Pat.
Hi, this is Pat McGonigal, and I'm going to say just a few words about how the Research Coordination Network began, the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. And I think, like all worthwhile activities, it has a history that we should acknowledge that led up to this point. And for myself, it started in 2011 with an effort by Conservation International to form a scientific working group around the science of blue carbon. And one of the early products that we identified as a major need within that group was a database where we could start to more formally share data. And similar conversations were happening in other groups within the USGS, the US Global Change Research Program, NOAA, and many other groups overseas. We were starting to pull together and synthesize data that had been published in individual papers, and that was helping to advance our understanding of regional and global stocks and budgets. But to make it to the next level and really advance the science of blue carbon, we recognized the need to draw together a community who could share data, ideas, and increase the pace of discovery. That was the topic of a workshop that was organized in Menlo Park, California in 2016. And this is the group that was gathered there. And I'll just make a couple points that it was supported by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, which was formed out of the NAFTA Treaty, Conservation International, USGS, and the attendees here were from countries all around the world sharing these interests, and not just the science community, but also the policy community and the management community. So from the very beginning, this group was interested in a very broad-based community building effort. And one of the many and perhaps most important recommendation that came out of this workshop was the idea that we needed to build a group around data sharing and data synthesis. The NSF proposal that has served as the first stepping stone for this effort emphasized those groups of stakeholders, scientists, management, regulation, and policy, and the fact that this would be a global community of people. It would be based here in the US, but with groups across the globe, who would cooperate, many of whom wrote letters of support for the proposal and have been involved really from the very beginning of this network. The proposal had a variety of different activities in it. We're going to emphasize a couple of these today, but you can, illustrated here are the primary types of activities that we propose to do. The data clearinghouse is a centerpiece here, but we also intend to use those data for training and collaboration, training and synthesis and computational tools. We very much intend to build a community around this activity and are very much interested in engaging, every individual has an interest in it, making everybody feel welcome and open to contributions. The science workshops are kind of a classic way to advance synthesis, which you'll hear a little bit more about. And in the interest of building, community-wide activity, open source modeling and tools is the fifth activity that we're emphasizing.
So this is Dave Klingus here, the database manager for the RCN, and I'm going to briefly outline our Coastal Carbon Atlas, which is a tool that is publicly available that will allow you to visualize, query, and download data that has been curated and compiled by our efforts. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to the Coastal Carbon Atlas right now. You can see that this is a live URL that we will distribute afterwards. So the atlas started with emphasis on the continental United States, compiling dated cores and carbon stocks from coastal wetlands in the US, but as you can see, we have global representation. So I'm going to skim through a couple of the options that allow you to subset the data according to your data types or region of interest. So I'm going to start with this panel right here. You can see I can select data types. And at the moment, I'll zoom in a little bit. We have carbon stocks readily available, but I can also choose other types of data. For instance, if I want dated cores to see how old the marsh is of interest, I can check that. We'll keep on carbon stocks as a whole. I can also select particular geographical attributes. So say that I'm only interested in a particular state of the United States, and I would like to access Florida data, for instance. So I've subsetted the atlas to just Florida data. I can click on this region of the map, and both the data that's displayed will be subsetted. I can click on a particular core, and you see when I click on one, there'll be some of the metadata of that core is available. I can see what the authors and study of that, the researchers involved in that fieldwork, as well as some of the species and data types represented. If I wanted to glance quickly at some of this data that had been subsetted, there are these other sets of tabs that allow me to skim through some of the subsetted data. I can see what the names of the sites were in our Florida data, as well as number of cores at each of those sites. I can go back to some of the methods data of how those cores were collected and the exact coordinates. I can look at the actual data itself across a depth series of the core. And this may be of interest to those that are doing data synthesis or modeling. And if I go back to the map, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit here. So I've subsetted to a particular region of interest. I can also do environmental attributes. So I'm going to clear out of our just subsetting of Florida and go back to our global representation. And perhaps I might be interested in only cores that have been collected under mangrove systems. So I can go ahead to a habitat code and select just mangrove. You can see if I zoom out, this demonstrates our global representation of mangrove systems. We in total have salt marshes, tidal swamps, and seagrasses also represented. So there's plenty of options that one can subset their data to. And once I've particularly queried the data that I'm interested in, so I'm going to go ahead back to just my Florida data. And I say I'm a land manager interested in the Everglades systems and want to see what data is readily available. Well, I can also download what I've subsetted before. And once I press this download data, you'll see a pop-up that will be a zip file. I go ahead and save that file. And within this zip file, you'll have a number of files related to the data itself, as well as some information about how it was collected. And this is quite important. I'm going to look at the README at first. For those that are users of the RCN database, we think it's very important to acknowledge the original data contributors by citing their source, as well as the curators that had synthesized these carbon stocks. So whenever one uses the map, we encourage you to read extensively through this documentation, as well as open up the bibliography that corresponds to the data. So this is a .bib file. For those that are unfamiliar with the bibtex format, you can use this in reference libraries like Mendeley or Zotero, and it will automatically import all of the studies corresponding to your downloaded data. So taking a look just at this itself, I won't spend too much time on it, but this demonstrates the citations for those data sets that I've subsetted to in the state of Florida. Finally, I can look at the disaggregated data itself, and this will correspond to what we were looking at on the table tabs before. So I have ready access to the Coastal Carbon's data clearinghouse for my synthesis or carbon accounting needs. I have a set of spreadsheets corresponding to the core level, to the depth series level, as well as a couple other spreadsheets for how the system represented or impacted. Say it was a natural wetland versus a restored wetland. Some additional methods data of how each of those publications, what type of publication they were, and finally the species of plants represented within these systems. So there's multiple levels of data within the Coastal Carbon RCN libraries, And we hope that this is a jumping off point for both the science purposes as well as the land management purposes. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here. So the Atlas is something that's in continued development, and we have a few other features that we want to continue building out. Being able to select according to other field or lab methods. Say you're only interested in a particular type of watershed, or perhaps only one method of how cores were collected. That's something we want to make more readily available. We've heard some interest of having summaries of this data rather than at the core level, having the data summarized at the watershed or state or country levels. And those are features and tools that we're building out at the moment. And of course, we're continually building the number of cores represented. We have about 5,400 soil cores within the Coastal Carbon Atlas right now, but that's continuously growing. But this is also a product that we're heavily invested in acquiring further feedback. We see that our efforts of compiling coastal carbon data is informed by a broad audience. And we're looking for your input of how we can develop these products. So through contacting us or through the feedback form on the map itself, you can help inform our priorities, and we'll take action upon what types of interests you demonstrate. Because our priorities are exactly underlined by what interest has been demonstrated to us. So now I'm going to send it back over to James, who's going to discuss the process of submitting data to the Coastal Carbon Clearinghouse and how we manage our data policies.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, the data library and the atlas with which you can view that data is still under development. And you know, one thing that we really hope to get out of promoting the interfaces is to find out about all the data we don't know about already. So if you are a scientist who has data, or you know someone who may have data, it'd be really great to just check through the interface to see if it's publicly available and citable in an appropriate way. If your data is not in the repository already, there are a few different ways that it can be in there. One of the things that we're really trying to push is helping data producers create data publications or data releases, essentially a separate data release that can go alongside a peer-reviewed paper or something like that, but it has the features that it is downloadable, citable, and that it is both human and machine readable and ready to analyze. This is something that that can happen in a couple different ways. First of all, if you have one of these data releases already, good job. You're awesome. All you need to do is email us and tell us about it, and we will write a couple custom scripts to download the data, to point to it, and to integrate it into our kind of consistent shape and format that our big data synthesis is in. Your data gets cited, you get pats on the back, everyone knows about your study, everything's great. If you don't have a data release, we can help you with that. We have staff who is specifically funded to provide this service for the community. You have to let us know whether or not you want what repository you want, where your data is going to live. If you have an obligation to use your university's data repository, or if you're a government researcher and if you're a USGS researcher, you need to use ScienceBase, we can essentially give you, we can do all the formatting and quality control for you, give you back the formatted data, and you can upload it to your repository, send us an email once it's ready. We'll essentially treat that like those outside data ingestions. If you want a repository, you can use the Smithsonian. We have an institutional partnership with Figshare, which is one of these community recognized stable repositories. And if you go with us, your author information is going to be the same as it is on the paper. No one from the Smithsonian is going to add themselves as an author to your data release. We just take on the roles of curators, and your data will be as safe as anything else the Smithsonian curates. I think, if anything, we have a good reputation for keeping things around for a long time. What you need to let us know if you're going to prepare a data release is whether or not you need an embargo period, whether you need to keep your data private until a paper's published. If not, it can go straight into the synthesis. Your data gets cited, you get pats on the back, everything's great. If you do need an embargo, we can do a full embargo, which means we don't tell anyone about your data, we don't promote it ahead of time, we just wait for you to push go. We can also do these partial embargoes where we share just the locations, the data types available, and the contact information in our map interface. And a lot of people really like this option because it allows them to promote ahead of time and possibly even collaborate or at least telegraph that certain areas have data, even if it's not fully released yet. This, I think, is a good way to get to establish collaborations and reduce any possible redundancy in people going out and planning field efforts. It turns out that there's a ton of data there already that people just didn't know about yet. We're trying to avoid that kind of thing. And that's kind of our role as coordination in a research coordination network. Sort of moving to the science and how a lot of this gets used, we really view our role as data curators and data aggregators as filling a really key role in these twin gears of iterative research and management decision making, where we are essentially doing data collection, and especially with our working groups, we're doing modeling, working towards forecasting, and then doing these iterative model assessments and hypothesis generations, iteratively improving the state of our knowledge, the quality of our data, and our ability to represent the processes using models. That pairs really well with the adaptive management framework, where people who are actually doing the hard work of making decisions and taking forecasts can take these science products that are coming out of our working groups, for example, using them to make decisions, using those decisions to develop data collection and monitoring efforts, and then also going through an adaptive cycle of making management decisions, generating alternatives, and assessing trade-offs. We really view the database as a conversation between these two communities that talks between these strategic outreach events and these models and forecasts. Our soil carbon working group has kind of been the guinea pig for this effort. The overall charge of this group is to improve the measuring, reporting, and modeling of carbon sequestration rates in coastal wetlands. We're focused on the contiguous US, but we're really hoping that a lot of the approaches that we propose can be scaled up and implemented in other places around the US. There are 17 researchers from all around the world, and we've had kind of this intensive collaboration model where we've been meeting pretty much monthly since July, and then had a immersive 2-day workshop in December here at CERT, where we really put a lot of hard work into both capping off what we had talked out collaborating remotely and planning our activities for the next few months. This is our soils working group. You can see that we have We have people from all stages of careers represented, from grad students to emeritus researchers. And if you want to be involved in these working groups, we are having one a year until 2022. Our next working group, we're going to start taking applications in June, and that's going to be methane modeling and mapping working group. And then the next 3 working groups after that are all kind of pending. We have proposed ones, proposed topics, but we're also taking, they're not set in stone, so we're taking community suggestions. Soils working group, just a couple of the activities that you may see coming out in the next months or years. Or we are currently using and expanding the data in our repository. We are translating the Jim Morris's marsh equilibrium model into R and using a Bayesian framework to make some useful analytic products out of that modeling structure. And we're ultimately aiming to provide usable carbon storage and sequestration forecasts at the scales that stakeholders can use. If you want to join the network, there are a lot of ways, a lot of entry points. I think one thing we want to come out of this webinar is starting here at the top, is to provide feedback on the atlas. We want help looking for bugs. And we especially want to know what other web products that you need to make useful information out of the raw data that we've aggregated all into one place. If you're downloading these data and you're like, I have no idea what to do with this, we can help you with that too. We are putting together tutorials in how to do data analysis with R code. We already have some outreach and lesson materials on our website, but we can also do run training events and training webinars similar to this, but with hands-on teaching for what to do with these tables once they're downloaded. You can submit data. That's probably, or let us know about data sources. Put us in touch with people who have data. This is a great way that you can participate and we can grow the network. If you can, we have a steering committee and we have a stakeholder committee. This is another thing that I really hope comes out of this webinar. If you want to provide leadership, or especially if you want to give us more regular feedback on how our science products and our data products could be used by stakeholders, please write to us. Please volunteer to join our stakeholder committee. This is where a lot of the work gets done and a lot of the decisions get made. It's a great way to participate, to show your commitment, and to show to have a leadership role in the community. If you are more of a code person and not so much a leader person, we are starting up a volunteer developer corps. I'll probably mention that in a little bit in my closing remarks. You can also apply for a workshop. These are great opportunities, especially for grad students and early career researchers. And anyone can sign up for our mailing list and follow our Twitter account at Coastal Carbon. That's where we do a lot of our updates on our activities and all that. So I'm gonna make a couple closing remarks on just the state of the network and our sustainability and kind of how we see ourselves growing, and then I'll leave it to Pat, who has closing remarks as well. You know, this is an NSF-funded research coordination network. We're funded for 5 years, and we have dedicated funding for full-time staff for 2 more years. After that, we have part-time funding for staff members. We really view this NSF funding as an opportunity to build a long-term sustainable program, but we are still building that, and we are hoping that by reaching out to the community like you, community members like you, that you will be partners and help us to grow this to be a sustainable community resource. One way that we're doing this is by plain old fundraising, writing grants, and that's one of the roles of our steering committee. So if you are a good grant writer and you want to see this become a sustainable endeavor, join our steering committee. We are also exploring kind of a PBS model, like if this content, if these activities are useful for you, consider donating. We at the Smithsonian, we can take donations from a good number of people, since we are a nonprofit. We can also work together on subawards or strategic priorities that serve both our interests. And we are also exploring kind of this volunteer developer-driven model where we have some dedicated support here at CERC, but a lot of the maintenance of our data structures and ingestion of new data, a lot of that falls on volunteer developers all around the world. And for that, if that perks your ears up, we really want to know, what would motivate you to participate in this way, to donate your time? Would it be getting credit on community products, seeing your name in lights? Would it be being a co-author on a community paper? We're really interested in exploring these opportunities. And the last thing to say is that being at Smithsonian, we have a lot of institutional support and potential collaborations, for example, with the Marine Geo program. And we have a lot of opportunities for building these we have a good track record of building these sustainable long-term programs. And we hope that we can continue to do that, but that you will also see the value in this and that you will take a stake in it.
Well, thanks, Jim. And this is Pat again. I'll just follow up with a couple short remarks, which is where Jim ended, take a stake in it. This activity has grown out of the NSF Research Coordination Network program, which is meant to build communities of practice primarily around science. But as I emphasized in the beginning, we have always thought of this as a partnership where science, policy, management, and regulation are shoulder to shoulder. And while the central activity of gathering and curating data is our primary focus, the next step, and having got to this point very fast, I might add, where we have a rich and robust data library, is to generate products and tools. And those tools and those products are really meant to serve all of the stakeholder groups, not just the science groups, the science, policy, and the management interests. And this is where we're looking for feedback from you. What are the tools that you need to advance your own interests? And to that end, we've formed a subgroup within our steering committee that's focused on stakeholder outreach. So we're very interested in hearing from you if you have interests. We're listening. And I think that wraps up our comments, Stephanie.
Great. Thanks, James, Pat, and Dave. I'm just going to open it up to questions now. We have one question in so far, and if any of our listeners have additional questions, please enter those into your question box on your GoToWebinar panel. So I'll go ahead and put the first question out there. Is there a plan to add National Cooperative Soil Survey data to this data set, or is it already being included?
The NCSS data is, if that's the it might, well, yeah.
Which data?
It's is the National Cooperative Soil Survey data.
Oh.
How about if you have the NCSS data? I know that there's a couple of different efforts that are in our kind of our priorities list. There's that EPA inventory, the Malik and Fennessy 2017 data. That one is in the research priorities list. I don't know if the NCSS data is in our research priorities list, but if you have this data, why don't you send us an email, and especially if there's already a link to the data, let us know, and we could put that. We prioritize data that are easy to cite and ingest.
Yeah, and
Great.
the question might also be referring to the soil survey data. I'm not sure, but it's important to emphasize that the data that we're collecting is point data and fairly detailed soil profiles. So on the soil side, we're also planning to add biomass data and perhaps flux data as we develop in the future. But any data that has a good a GPS location and profile information, we're particularly interested in.
Great, thanks. And the questioner did include a link, and I'll share that with you guys as well.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
So I actually don't see any more questions at this time. I think that's probably because you guys gave a great presentation. It was very informative. I have our contact information up on the screen, so if you have additional questions for our speakers, you can contact them directly. And if you have future webinar topic suggestions, you can also contact me. A recording of this webinar, as I mentioned before, will be posted online shortly after. And I will also include that in the follow-up email to all of our registrants. And seeing no additional questions, I'll say we'll go ahead and close this webinar up early. So thank you very much, Pat and James and Dave, for taking time to speak with us today about the RCN and the Atlas. And thank you to all of our listeners for attending and submitting questions. And any last minute words or anything from Pat from the CERC team?
Well, this, by the way, is the first opportunity we've really had to present the data atlas to a large group outside of our core, and we're really excited by the response to the webinar, the number of people who signed up, and we hope that you help us spread the word that this resource is available, and as always, we're a very friendly bunch here, so get a hold of us if you have any ideas.
Great. Thanks so much, Pat. We'll be sure to spread the word. And thank you for attending today. Great. And have a great afternoon, everyone.
All right. Bye.